Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's chat with me, Peter Watson, and my good friend and resident genius, Ralph Hebgen. This week, we're going to talk about what Rishi Sunak talked about in the Conservative Party conference and the potential impact. So that means that we're going to talk about HS2, smoking, and A levels, right? So, and not all at the same time, of course. Interesting combination. But anyway, so unless you've been living in a cave or something for the last week or so, or indeed maybe you were maybe you were in a cave for the last week, anxious to listen to this very podcast. In order to inform you of the most important bits of news of the week. I would say that HS2, the main thing that HS2 was that the extension from Birmingham to Manchester was cancelled. I mean, it had been trailed for quite a while beforehand. He didn't commit either way, but it sounded like it was, and that was confirmed. The only, I'd say a small positive was that they did commit to going all the way into Euston rather than stopping at Old Oak or wherever. Sorry to residents of wherever that is. So anyway, so that was a small positive in my mind because I think, it's like it's actually going into London, although I know that Ralph is going to talk about that in a minute. So I think that was interesting, although I think it has emerged in the last few days that extension into Euston sounds like it's dependent on private sector funding. So we don't know what's happening there, but anyway, so I thought it was interesting. And the other thing, of course, is that he decided so the £36 billion that would have been they said that they would save by not doing this extension would be spent on projects in the north. So that's roads and rail to try to improve the structure up there. For what it's worth, I think overall I would have liked, in theory, if you're going to promise to do a line, you do a line, right? But obviously things have happened. Working habits have changed. All that kind of, costs have just got ridiculous. Commodity prices and all that kind of stuff as well. Not to mention labour costs, all that kind of stuff has all meant everything has changed. So I think that ultimately they had to take a position. They've taken a position, and this is where we are. So anyway, I'll shut up now. But Ralph, what do you think about that?
Yes, first of all, in general of the party conference, I sort of came away a little bit underwhelmed, perhaps, because I was hoping for maybe more incisive announcements by Mr. Sunak, whose platform, of course, it was to take in order to sway any voters for the coming election year. But it wasn't all bad. I mean, some people were supporting Mr. Sunak. He will, of course, invite lots of criticism, as all politicians always do, invariably, with whatever they announce. But so overall, I thought maybe one would have hoped for slightly more visionary statements for the shaping of the future Britain, but we have what we have, and I think on balance it wasn't it was certainly not disappointing. I personally am a little bit underwhelmed. So starting with the HS2 link, this is a difficult one, isn't it? Because it's probably the center of the package of announcements which was made, and in in and of itself, it's not positive. There is an infrastructure project which has been cancelled, but Mr. Sunak and the party spin doctors were basically presenting this as if it was a vision for Britain moment. That in itself, if you look at it at face value, it makes you smile. So somebody scrapped the key infrastructure project. Hey, this is going to be fantastic for the future. So, so obviously that doesn't necessarily immediately follow. It's an obvious one, but if you stand back and analyze it in exactly the way in which you did, Peter, then it sort of becomes a more courageous statement, really. Because first, two things, I think, two large things have changed since the project was originally envisaged, I think, as early as 15 years ago with all the planning involved. And one is clearly, as you mentioned, inflation. I said it again. Inflation has increased.
It wouldn't be a podcast without the I word, would it?
Of
Really?
course not.
Yeah.
And so inflation has increased costs massively.
Mhm.
And second, the pandemic has proven to people that new technology can be used productively for remote working and working from home. So these two things have changed the commercial viability of the project, and also, one might argue to some extent, perhaps, the necessity of the project. Just illustrating the first one, I doubt anybody would have planned the project in the scope which it had the costs been what they were emerging to be now with inflation 10 years ago. If that statement still makes sense, it was quite complicated. Actually, I didn't understand what I was saying there. So basically, if we had 36 billion for the last phase, if that had been the cost 10 years ago, I don't think we would have planned it in this way in the first place. So it would have it wouldn't have been there in the first place, and now it is no longer there either. So the net effect is the same thing. And second, I think it is a good thing because the investment here, the 36 billion of pounds of inflated costs, they are not being cancelled entirely in terms of infrastructure for the North. They are being used to pull the North together in terms of travelling infrastructure, rail infrastructure, innovation, and maintenance and upgrading of existing links. And I think that is probably, given where we are, the more sensible thing to do. So although at first sight it sounds like almost a little bit comical to suggest that we're cancelling this thing, that's a vision for the future, it probably does emerge as both a courageous thing to do to avoid throwing good money after bad, and second, a beneficial thing to do because the money isn't scrapped and used for something else in the southeast. It does go to the benefit of investments in the north, and that's what we arguably need. Just one side comment on this, because that does amuse me, because we always do a little pre-chat before we come on the air, and we were discussing at length the London link of this, and we were discussing that originally it was moored for the link to end in Old Oak Station, I think that's where it is, and I'm basically saying, well, that wouldn't have been so much of a problem because we have the Elizabeth line now, and so people come down to Old Oak Station, go into London with the Elizabeth line, and kind of filter away into the tube in this way. But that's not my side comment. My side comment is, isn't it amusing that we're talking again about the southeast and London? It's not about the southeast. This is about the north, so let's forget about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, just as we're on side notes, I thought it was interesting when you said you were underwhelmed.
Yeah.
I remember I saw on some chat show sometime that someone said you can be overwhelmed, you could be underwhelmed, but you're never whelmed. You'll never go somewhere and say, "Do you know what? I was quite whelmed by that place." There's never whatever happened to whelming. That's what I want to know.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's probably because it's like it doesn't really transport any information.
No.
Because if you think about it, if you say I was whelmed, my expectations were
Well, met.
exactly met by
Yes.
what was
Yeah.
going on.
Just imagine
Actually,
what that would have in a job like your annual assessment. Your boss is sitting there. You say you've hit your targets. I am completely whelmed. I mean, that would be great, right? I mean, maybe we should start this. Maybe we should all start being whelmed. So
I think I
just
like that. So if your boss is whelmed, then that basically means your bonus is going to be zero. Because otherwise you did exactly what you were paid for in your
exactly what we
in
paid
your
for. Yeah,
basic salary, and
yeah,
therefore you can
yeah,
now
yeah,
leave the room, to
yeah.
sanitize an expression which was at the tip of my tongue.
Yes, I
And
know. And I saw that was manifested by the number of fingers you just held up just then. Right?
yeah, flicking the
So,
V,
yeah, yeah,
flicking the V's at the
yeah,
employee. Yeah,
exactly.
cool. But yeah,
So, yeah. Anyway,
actually,
sorry. So that was good.
overwhelming is
Yeah,
payment of a bonus. But what's underwhelming?
yeah. That's well done for keeping your job. That's your. I don't know. Yeah, no, it could do better. But
Anyway, very good.
anyway,
Yeah.
well, I think this is a very important discussion, but we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that. The next bit was about smoking, and that is just essentially about increasing the legal age for smoking every year. So if essentially you'll be left with the legal age of smoking will get older and older. And to the extent that again we came up with this image which I'll share with you as in mental image, not actual image, of sort of 50-year-old men hanging out outside a Sainsbury's waiting for older people with Zimmer frames and saying, "Hey mate, could you get us some cigarettes, please?" So that would be so funny, but that's what might happen. So yeah, so I. Well, anyway, first of all, what are your thoughts on this whole smoking thing?
Well, maybe I should start hanging out at the local Tesco to
Oh
actually
no,
make some money of the
yeah, yeah, that's right.
young geezers. Unfortunately, it's not there yet.
Yes,
In 40 years' time, we're gonna
yeah,
be there, or 30 or something. Yeah, well,
making it rain with the cigarettes. Come on, people. I'm 65, but hey. Anyway, sorry.
yeah,
Yeah,
very
carry on.
good.
Yeah,
Yes, well, God, I've got this image in my mind now with the Zimmer frame,
yeah,
wielding elderly gentlemen and ladies
yeah,
dispensing cigarettes outside the Tesco or at London Bridge
yeah.
or whatever.
Hey man, we've all got to have something to aspire to, right? So
Absolutely.
yeah,
So, yeah, yeah, I was. That was the underwhelming a little bit,
yes,
So, so I don't smoke myself, so I don't really care that much. But it was sort of like, well, smoking, really? That's a big thing, or that's one of the big things. But then again, if you stand back from it, I mean, something needs to be done in terms of the expense pressure
mm,
on the NHS. We all know this. I mean, politicians have been moaning about the NHS for the last 500 years,
mm,
as far as I know, certainly since I entered the country.
mhm,
Uh, and something needs to be done. Everybody knows this, but politicians never tend to do very much about the NHS, I
mm,
feel. And at least here is an initiative which will reduce meaningfully the expense pressure on the NHS.
mm,
But of course, it will take a long time before I just use the word meaningfully. I mean, it will take a long time before it measurably emerges as a reduction in expenses from the NHS. But and at the same time, it reduces tax revenues. But it does so. I mean, I don't know exactly the dynamics here, of course, but somebody will have modeled it, one would hope. And so you would think that this gradual increase of the legal smoking age of 1 year every year will will of course reduce tax revenue slowly, but one would hope that it would commensurately reduce the expenses for the NHS for smoke-related diseases. Probably not in the same way. I mean, the impact of tax revenues ought to be linear in some way.
Yeah.
And that's not going to be the same the case for the expense reduction for the NHS. But eventually, of course, if this policy is going to be kept, then we will see this type of transfer from tax revenue to reduction in expenses with the NHS. And I think that's a fair initiative. There are aspects to it which are not central to it. People are complaining that it limits your choice as an adult, but so many things are limited by regulation. Nobody, I don't believe, complains vociferously about the need to put on a safety belt or a helmet when I ride my motorcycle or anything of that nature. And the justification for these regulations is exactly the same thing. I mean, it's not as if we love people to have safety belts on. It's because it reduces accident costs and therefore the costs on the National Health Service. And that is a viable way of doing it. But it is funny, isn't it? If this is to be kept, then in 40 years' time, we're going to have exactly the situation. We're going to have 50-year-olds and they're sort of
suddenly incredibly, they
wondering.
sort of go through their youth, they come through, get older, and then suddenly they get incredibly popular once again. I think it's interesting. I mean, I've forgotten whether I said this in a podcast the other day, but it just seems to me this is a way of the government looking like they're doing something when actually it's not really going to affect anything realistically. Most of the money that you pay for a pack of cigarettes goes to the government in tax. So, this is what I was saying. If they really wanted to stop smoking, they'd say, right, smoking is now illegal. But the fact of the matter is, the money they get from tobacco companies paying tax comes in quite handy. So, at the same time as looking like they want to do something for the health of the nation, at the same time they don't want to cut off their tax revenues, which again you can understand. So,
but that's sensible. I would interpret that to mean that this is actually a sensible way of doing it. Because nobody wants to cut off smoking. People want to relieve the expenses on the NHS. But if you cut it off now, then what you say is right. I mean, the only effect that would have is to cut off tax revenues from 1 week to the next, from whatever it is, to zero. But you are not going to see the commensurate release of expenses or release of pressure on the NHS at the same time. So arguably in this way that will phase in better. But yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen the numbers. I'm sure somebody modeled it. It sounds good, and it's a good initiative. I mean, nobody can. Well, I suppose some people can find fault with it, but I think it's a sensible thing to do.
Absolutely.
It's better than my idea, which is like a
your idea is
draconian,
pretty
Germanic top down, idea, which is basically saying, well, no, we are happy for you to have your choice as an adult, but if you choose to smoke, you also give up the right to be treated on the NHS for smoke-related diseases. The choice is yours. I do wonder how many people would then say, "Oh, yeah, cool, fantastic! I'm going to get my ciggies."
Exactly.
But this is, of course, a completely unacceptable thing, which only lives in my head, and I apologize. I apologize for my
Hepburn's world.
for my rigorous.
Good. Talking about rigorous, that brings us very nicely onto the next subject.
Oh, it does.
And when I say subject, I mean
Oh, it does. Oh, I see what you're
Yeah,
doing
yeah,
here.
yeah,
That's very
yeah.
clever. Yeah.
Yeah, it's about A levels,
Hmm.
and specifically the reform of A levels, and it's a reform. It would be a new standard. It would be a new, basically a sort of a baccalaureate, and it would be about. So the whole thing is it's all about the UK being probably an outlier in terms of subject specialisation at arguably too young an age. Now, so what I mean by this is, generally speaking, you go from taking, I don't know, 10, 11, I mean, anything between 8 and 12, maybe, GCSEs. And then suddenly you're doing 3 or 4 A levels, perhaps. Um, and and they're saying that, that's too sudden. There should be 5 subjects studied at A level. And I think that is, that is a major departure from what has been going on up until now. Initially, all the educational leaders have said, well, this isn't going to work because at the moment we can't attract enough teachers, and we have trouble retaining them, and we're definitely going to need more teachers, which is fair enough. But I think, in terms, if you were to look at the sort of point of view from the pupils being educated, um, I think that keeping your options open for as long as possible is a good thing. I mean, I myself went to university in Japan for 2 years, and during that time, I was put in with all the other foreigners, the Americans, Canadians, Chinese, Koreans, all over. And it was interesting because we talked about our respective, um, education. And we did have other exciting conversations as well, I'll have you know. But but we also did talk about serious stuff as well. It's not all play,
It's
but
not all plain
it's
how
not.
and how to get facts from the local
Yes,
drugstore.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So, and we're talking in the sense of cigarettes there for anyone American listening.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that, um, what seemed to come out of all that was that, generally speak, more. It seems to me that more people outside the UK tend to have a broader education, um, for longer. And so, if you would say that is a good thing, um, if you're going to jump from 3 to 5 subjects, I would have thought that you're going to have to lower the standards of A levels, because you won't be able to do them in depth as if you were doing 3 subjects. Um, but if that happened, I'm arguing that you need to change university as well. So you need to change it so that you have maybe a foundation year at university, where you kind of top up the areas that you need to top up with. But I would also suggest that you could perhaps try different courses, or do different subjects. And I think that would help, a catch up with what they had before. It would help universities because they get more money, because we all have to go to uni for a year longer, because actually doing a degree in 3 years is I think is relatively unusual in the world. It's usually a bit longer. So anyway, so I think having a foundation year would be good from that point of view. It would also give you a better idea of what it is you are going to be studying, so that you will be able to make a more informed decision when you choose which degree you're going to do. Because that's the thing. I mean, I do think it's quite scary as an A level student, thinking, what do I want to do at university? I mean, on the one hand, you could say, well, I did well in this A level, and so I suppose I'll do that. I mean, I did law, and so law is completely different. So you've got to be willing to take the leap. Well, I did law and Japanese, so you've got to willing to take the leap. Whereas I think if you have a foundation year, like I believe they do in America, you can do certain courses that get you. They call them credits. Um, to so that you have to get a certain standard, but then you are also allowed to audit, which means just sit in. You don't have to sit the exams. You could do, you could do the work if you want to, but it doesn't count.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a great thing. So you can do that in your first year, and that way you'll be able to pick. You'd feel better about. I would have thought you're more likely to feel better about what you've picked. The other thing I think I've said before is, if you do that, then I would have thought that you would be really good if you could have the opportunity to do that foundation year in a university that's not necessarily the one that you ultimately want to go to, because that then gives you the option of potentially living at home for a bit longer to save on costs and stuff. Because that's another problem, is not only are you trying to think about what you're going to do for the next few years with not that much information and not that much certainty, you're also committing to quite a lot of money. So anyway, yeah. So obviously you yourself have come through a different system.
Mm.
What do you think? I mean, so what do you think about his idea to make the new A levels broader?
Yeah, education is a hugely difficult topic to discuss, isn't it, and to go through, because
Yeah.
it's never quite clear what you want to engineer the system to be. I mean, what's the result? What's the intended result, and what do students do with it? So, for example, if you take a look at the US, as far as I know the system, there you always have 2 years of general studies, which are prefixing, so to speak, every degree you take. So whatever you do, if you do law, I believe,
Actually, I
if
don't know if you can do law undergrad in America. I don't think. I'm not sure.
no, you can go to Harvard Law School, for
But
example.
that's law school. I think you have to do a degree first, then you go to law school. I think. I'm not sure.
That may be, but
Yeah.
I don't know exactly the details. But
Mm.
if you do a degree at a university, let's pick Harvard, just to
Mm-hmm.
say that this is not going to be restricted to universities which are not top level, Ivy League or whatever. It happens at every university in the US. So if you pick anything, you do it at Harvard, then even at Harvard, you would need to do 2 years of general studies before you actually move on to your chosen degree subject.
Mm.
However, in America, you don't have A levels. So in other words, the total number of years spent in education is sort of roughly the same as that which we have in the UK. But you are able to leave school with an educational level that does not include, or which is not equivalent to, the level which you have in the UK with A levels. Because the A level equivalent, these 2 years of general studies, they are part of your university degree, in inverted commas, even though the degree specialization is 3 years on top of these 2 years. So basically you have school, you can leave without an A level equivalent, and then if you go on to university, the A level equivalent is sort of provided by the general studies. So I'm just mentioning this as one system, and then we compare and contrast later. And then Germany, which is of course where I did my A levels and my first university degree, well, I can't be too specific on it. I can be specific on it. I just don't know to which extent it is representative of what we do in Germany now, because I did my A levels there. Well, there was a land bridge between the UK and France when I when I did this, like 2,000 years ago, and
yeah.
but at that time I looked up how many subjects I did take to A levels, and it was 8. So I did 8 subjects to A level. So when I hear that 3 upgrades to 5 is an onus, then relative to what used to be the case in Germany, it would actually be much less than I did. But I don't know exactly how it compares. It may have been that the subjects taught in Germany were at a less intense level. So I don't really know this. But I know that I did about 30 to 35 hours of schoolwork in a week. So there was a lot of work which went into that. So when you left school with A levels, you had a pretty good general grounding because you were not allowed to only take studies from the humanities block. You had to also take studies from the maths plus sciences block. So and then you would go on to university, where, however, you would start immediately with your chosen subject of specialization.
Yeah.
So in the UK, it appears to be sort of in the middle there somewhere. Yes, it's an early specialization, more than I would like, to be honest, because 3 subjects in itself is, I don't think, enough. 8 subjects may be a bit over the top, but 5 subjects is sort of a good level of quantity of subjects to look at, I think. Because if you think about what might that, for example, be, might be maths and biology plus English plus one other language. Where are we for? And then you have business studies if you want, or computer science or something relevant, or maybe philosophy if you like it esoteric. But you know, or maybe even grammar, which you can still study at Oxford and Cambridge. It's called grades, I think. Latin, Greek, anything. It doesn't really matter. Anything which trains your mind is a good sort of level of education.
Yeah.
But your point is interesting. If we up this from 3 to 5, yes, one would think that perhaps the intensity will dilute. One might think maybe you put in a few more hours of work during the week. But there's another aspect here which we haven't discussed yet. I think in terms of what I read about it, it is planned to invent a new standard, the British Advanced Standard, I think it is called.
Yeah, I mean that's the name they're going to.
Exactly.
They're giving it that name. Yeah.
But
Advanced
that
British
is more than
Standard.
just a name. It doesn't replace A levels. It includes T levels.
Okay.
And I didn't even know T level existed. I mean, this is something which is post GCSE, 2 years, and it's more like what we call an apprenticeship in Germany, this sort of thing. And so you do now wonder whether the sort of blend or amalgamation of A and T levels will lead to a sort of unhappy medium, a reduction in the quality of the A levels to levels which you perhaps might criticize as not equivalent for an A-level education. And at the same time, an upping of levels in the T levels, which you arguably wouldn't need if you wish to actually embark on a non-academic career. So I don't know what that aspect of it is, but in general, I think it is not a bad thing to increase the subjects from 3 to 5. That makes sense to me. And then you can focus on university. The foundational year of which you speak that's not something which we find in the press. That's not suggested by the Tory party as being part of this reform, but I think it's an interesting idea. I know that I would have benefited from a year of sort of let my mind roam free at university, just to dip in some other subjects. I may have chosen a different academic route at university. Who knows?
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's very interesting. I mean, we are talking a long way into the future. This isn't going to happen overnight. So I think they said something like, if you're going into primary education now, then this might be relevant for you. So very interesting. Overall, underwhelmed, overwhelmed, possibly whelmed, I'd say.
Well, I'd say this. I mean, what I what I think well, I was going to say the world doesn't care. What I think the UK would have needed to hear from this party conference is visionary leadership.
Hmm.
The fact that all these changes, which we discussed, are long-term, potentially beneficial, that's fine. Vision is by its very nature long-term. But we live in times, unfortunately, where we have pressing problems that need to be tackled short-term. And I may have missed this, but it was certainly not headline. I would have wanted to see something more tangible, perhaps in energy policy. And maybe some other ways in which the inflationary pressure on household income could be remedied in the short term. Now, I know this is perhaps not something which I can justifiably want, because it was about vision and there has to be long term, but perhaps something about energy policy would have fitted into this as well. And if I missed it, I apologize, but it was certainly not something that was drawn out by the press as headline results from the Tory conference. So I think underwhelmed.
Underwhelmed.
Yes.
Okay. So on that bombshell of being both whelmed and underwhelmed, and if you take an average of our state of whelmness, then overall, I guess it's underwhelmed.
Well, it's not quite underwhelmed. If underwhelmed is one level and whelmed is the other, then maybe this is subwhelmed.
Oh no, that's overwhelmed. So whelmed, I'm neutral. You're underwhelmed. Therefore, if you took the average of our whelmedness, then it would be below. It would be slightly underwhelmed.
I was going to say slightly underwhelmed. It has to be in the middle.
Yes.
For which I will now coin the phrase subwhelmed.
Subwhelmed. Love it. I mean, this is great. I mean, this is what it's all about, right? It's about
talking rubbish
about important things that affect our lives. So it's all good.
Good.
Brilliant. Okay, well, as usual, lots of fun. Thank you so much for your thoughts. As always, always looking forward to more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody, for listening, and I hope everybody was not subwhelmed, but overwhelmed.
Yes,
or at least whelmed.
Yeah,
whelmed
absolutely.
Would be good.
We're aiming for whelmed, right? We're aiming for whelmed.
Always.
Anyway, thanks a lot.
Good stuff. Thanks for listening, guys. Thank you.
Bye.